OK. Donc, mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue à notre troisième panel, celui sur la coopération transatlantique, avec un élément aussi qui portera sur la région Pacifique. J'aimerais vous introduire à notre partenaire stratégique, Louis Bibeau, fondateur et directeur général de Logistique Unicor. Merci beaucoup, Louis.
Oui.
La parole est à toi.
OK. Merci. Bonjour tout le monde. OK. C'est un honneur et un grand plaisir d'être parmi vous, distingués participants et distingués intervenants. OK. En tout cas, comme dit Henri, vient de dire Louis Bibeau. Je suis fondateur et directeur général de Logistique Unicor. We need not to look further than the topic on everyone's mind and lips over the last few weeks to be reminded against how interconnected and interreliant the world has become in so many levels. The coronavirus crisis is a powerful reminder of just how important the world outside our respective border, okay, is to our own individual and collective health, safety, and security. It underscores again the need for solid institutions and organizations that provide the level of international cooperation necessary to maintain global safety, security, and ultimately stability. This afternoon, we will have a hearing from senior military leader on the way forward for global transatlantic cooperation. My own background as a businessman also illustrates how critical these institutions are for sustaining our environment that foster progress and economic growth. When I founded Logistic Unicor in 1992, I recognized the opportunity to apply the concept of prime vendor management for spur innovation in the business of managing uniform program. I realized that it was a different way of doing things that could improve service while lowering the program costs for Canadian organizations such as the Department of National Defense. I work and I've been managing Canadian Army Forces uniform program continuously since 1996. As in the case of many companies, early on our focus was uniquely domestic, but we're gradually able to recognize the opportunity to export our new industry paradigm to other countries. We have expanded internationally in consequence. Today, we are a global company. Our subsidiary manufactures combat uniform for NATO partners like France, Germany, and we are the main supplier of the Australian Defence Force. In the previous year or previous past, we used to dress the UK military for the wet weather garment. Also we start a new program providing the underwear for the US Marine. And also we developed an exoskeleton with the US SOCOM, which the French are trying right now, and it was the first in the parade of the independence during the independence on the parade in the 14th of July. Okay, and also an extensive production facility in Tunisia and also in Vietnam. It's therefore not lost to me as a founder and CEO that our ability to function and thrive in the international market are directed result of stability assured by international cooperation. As a businessman, this is critical to our supply chain because assurance of trade and movement of goods between countries are essential for our operation. But it is, and foremost, on the structural side, because NATO and other organizations fostering international cooperation provide the very foundation for security upon which domestic and global business, trade, and progress are built. For this reason, I am honored to introduce our moderator, Rick Fadden, who was the CDA Institute VME Award recipient this year. Okay. He was also the National Security Advisor to our Prime Minister from January 2015 to March 2016. And previously, he was Deputy Minister of National Defense 2013-15, and also served as Director of the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service from 2009 to 2013. We have the Vice-Amiral Henri Schrike. Schrike, OK. Officier général et responsable des affaires internationales de l'état-major des armées françaises. Auparavant, il occupait le poste de directeur adjoint de cabinet opérations de l'état-major, avant lequel il était le chef des affaires internationaux pour l'Europe, l'Amérique du Nord, l'OTAN, l'Union européenne et l'ONU. We have from UK, Lieutenant General Robert Magawon is the Deputy Commander of Strategic Command for UK MOD. he most recently served as Assistant Chief of Defense Staff for Capability and Force Design for the MOD, prior to which he had served as Commandant of General Royal Marine and the Commandant of United Kingdom, UK Amphibious Force and Chief of Staff of Navy HQ. We also have the Admiral Phil Davidson. He's the Commander of United States Indo-Pacific Command. Prior to this command, he has served as the Commander of the U.S. Fleet, Force Fleet Command and Naval Force U.S., Northern Command. Previously, he was served as the Commander of the U.S. Sixth Fleet and also the Commander of Naval Striking Support Force of Nato. Aussi, nous avons ici le lieutenant-général Mike Rouleau et le commandant des opérations interarmées du Canada. Auparavant, il a dirigé le commandement des forces d'opération spéciales du Canada entre 2014 et 2018. Puis j'aimerais souligner aussi que grâce à Major Rouleau, on a développé ce fantastique uniforme brun qu'on espère que tout le monde adapte dans le futur. Et merci. Puis là, je laisse la place à
Well, thank you very much and welcome everyone. Just for the sake of certainty, because this is just after lunch, I want to confirm this is not the nap room. This is the room where we're going to talk about transatlantic cooperation. We have a very distinguished panel. I'd just like to give you a bit of a sense of how we're going to proceed. I'm going to ask the panelists to talk from their perspective for 10 to 12 minutes. We'll then have a bit of an exchange between the panel, and then depending upon whether or not you've taken me at my word that this is not a nap room, we will take questions from the audience, and at the very end, I'll give everyone 2 or 3 minutes to sum up either their objections or their support for what has been said. To just start things off, I just thought I would take 1 minute. I've been around panels long enough to know that these gentlemen are going to say what they want to say, despite what I say. But I'd like to encourage them to talk a little bit about transatlantic. What does that mean? Does it mean NATO? Does it mean more than NATO? Does it mean less than NATO? Cooperation, for what purpose? Against what purpose? What threat are we trying to address? And one of my hobby horses has been that we should never try and look at a particular strategic issue without looking at the world at large. So I'm hoping that as they make their comments, they'll also talk about changes that we've seen in the world overall. How does that affect cooperation? I don't think I'm, revealing any state secret. There is a sense in the world that U.S. leadership has changed over the last 10 years or so. Is that the case? If so, what impact has it had or not have in the kind of cooperation that we're talking about? So with that as a bit of a prod, can I encourage Admiral Schrike to start?
Merci. Voilà, nous sommes partis pour un court moment français dans cette conférence. Donc avant tout, merci pour cette invitation. Et j'avoue qu'en tant que marin, je suis particulièrement sensible au sujet qui va être traité lors de ce panel. Donc je suis particulièrement sensible à l'esprit transatlantique, ne serait-ce que pour des raisons de géographie. Accessoirement, dans ma carrière, j'ai navigué un peu partout où on trouve les Canadiens, Britanniques, Américains et Français sur les mers. Donc un esprit et une histoire qui rappelle énormément d'enjeux que je vais essayer de brosser rapidement. Et puis, on ne l'a peut-être pas assez dit depuis le début, mais 2020 est certainement une année extrêmement décisive pour les deux côtés de l'Atlantique. Entre des élections d'un côté, un Brexit de l'autre, des gouvernements qui cherchent à se placer et qui affichent des ambitions, des revues stratégiques, enfin bref. Donc 2020, année décisive, année critique pour le lien transatlantique en général. Le lien transatlantique, ou le monde transatlantique, c'est un état d'esprit, un club, c'est une histoire, et donc c'est assez naturellement également l'OTAN. Et pourquoi est-ce que j'évoque ça? C'est parce que, faut-il le rappeler, la France a toujours été un membre fondateur de toutes les grandes alliances collectives ou alliances occidentales du XXe siècle. Du coup, nous osons nous poser en alliés crédibles, solidaires, exigeants vis-à-vis de cette alliance. Alors, exigeant, je sais que certains traduisent ça par empêcheur de tourner en rond, donc je ne sais pas si c'est facile à traduire en anglais, mais ceux qui connaissent l'expression saisiront la nuance. Ça, c'est une chose. L'autre chose qui me marque, personnellement, c'est qu'on considère le lien transatlantique, l'OTAN même, comme un fait établi. Finalement, cette histoire est extrêmement récente. Nous oublions que le monde transatlantique, l'ensemble géographique, et même les acteurs autour de cet ensemble géographique, ont finalement été en conflit, voire en compétition très, très ouverte pendant très longtemps. Et c'est seulement depuis la fin de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale que, par la force des choses, nous avons décidé de travailler ensemble. Et donc la question qui se pose finalement, c'est à quel point cet ensemble extrêmement récent est-il fragile ou fragilisé aujourd'hui? Le moins qu'on puisse dire, c'est que notre histoire commune, on va dire quasiment jusqu'au milieu de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, est quand même marquée par des jalousies, des querelles, des compétitions ouvertes, des trahisons, des alliances, des jalousies. Bref, l'alliance a été créée dans un contexte de très forte dépendance à l'allié américain, et l'alliance a été assimilée naturellement à un espace géographique puisqu'on tournait autour de la défense collective. Simultanément, je ne vais pas trop m'étendre là-dessus, l'histoire ou la relation politique de la France avec l'OTAN a été assez compliquée jusqu'en 2009, avec des hauts et des bas. Je suis persuadé que certains regrettent encore que le siège de l'OTAN ne soit plus en banlieue parisienne, mais c'est ainsi. Et donc maintenant, nous sommes revenus entièrement. Donc cette alliance, elle a contribué à notre sécurité, elle nous a apporté doctrine, éducation militaire, ça a été un test de l'excellence de nos matériels, ça nous a confrontés également à la problématique de la gestion d'espace étendue pour notre défense, avec des moyens de défense, eux, qui sont en baisse depuis 70 ans. Et il y a du coup un désintérêt avec la disparition en apparence d'une menace à nos frontières. Pourtant, nous sommes aujourd'hui testés en permanence et la confiance que nous avons en cette institution est testée elle aussi. Or, nous, dans cette salle aujourd'hui, nous avons hérité de cette alliance, nous avons hérité de ce bijou, mais nous considérons que finalement c'est la norme, nous sommes finalement dans notre zone de confort. Que faisons-nous aujourd'hui pour mériter toujours cette alliance? Voilà peut-être la question que nous devons nous poser. Alors nous sommes testés parce que l'alliance a été un succès politique et militaire dans le domaine de la défense collective. Et c'est plus que ça. L'alliance a été capable d'expérimenter, au-delà de sa mission première, expérimenter avec succès également, de nouvelles capacités expéditionnaires, l'approche globale, etc. Entre autres, l'Alliance a été capable d'adapter en permanence ses structures à l'évolution de l'environnement géopolitique et à l'environnement technologique. Et quand on parle de s'adapter, aujourd'hui, oui, les outils militaires se sont finalement adaptés en permanence, et ce que j'appelle les outils militaires, ça comprend les structures de commandement. Qu'en est-il finalement du niveau politique ou de la vision politique de l'Alliance? C'est d'autant plus important qu'il y a quand même des sondages récents qui portent sur 19 pays de l'Alliance, qui montrent que l'adhésion à l'OTAN et même au principe de défense collective s'effrite dans nos populations. Ça, il faudrait que ça nous réveille un peu brutalement. Il faudrait que ce soit un wake-up call. Désolé pour cet anglicisme. Aujourd'hui, il y a probablement une triple crise de cette alliance transatlantique. Une crise de solidarité, une crise de leadership et certainement également une crise de responsabilité des Européens. Alors, quels sont les facteurs de cohésion sur lesquels il faut travailler? Il reste finalement l'identification des menaces, les institutions politico-militaires et ces normes que nous avons développées dans l'OTAN, ces doctrines, critères d'interopérabilité, etc. Quels sont les défis que nous devons relever? C'est bien celui des intérêts divergents, du risque également du découplage trop fort d'intérêts de sécurité ou même de bilatéralisation des garanties de sécurité au sein de l'Alliance. Si on introduit au sein de l'Alliance trop de logique transactionnelle, nous serons perdants et en plus nous donnons un spectacle. La question que nous devons nous poser en permanence est la suivante: ne faisons-nous pas par hasard le jeu des grands compétiteurs, de nos grands compétiteurs? Voilà, il y a plusieurs scénarios possibles pour l'Alliance. Une alliance qui disparaît, ou une alliance qui se fracture, ou une alliance capable de continuer à vivre et d'être aussi forte. Et ça, c'est bien notre mission aujourd'hui. Dans cette alliance, il y a 4 acteurs principaux qui sont représentés dans ce panel aujourd'hui. Et en fait, ces 4 acteurs principaux, on les retrouve également en Indo-Pacifique. Alors pourquoi est-ce que je parlais un peu de l'Indo-Pacifique? Non pas parce que je souhaiterais voir l'OTAN y être, ce n'est pas du tout le cas, mais c'est parce que cet état d'esprit, ce club, cette capacité à travailler ensemble, on doit également retrouver là. Et là, on revient bien sur un des sujets du panel qui est transatlantique, global, etc. Alors pourquoi la France est-elle intéressée par la région, par la zone Indo-Pacifique? Alors d'abord, parce que de façon prétentieuse, nous en sommes un pays riverain. Ça fait partie de notre histoire. Nous y avons 7 territoires d'outre-mer. Il y a 2 millions de Français qui habitent dans cette région. Et puis, ce que je trouve particulièrement intéressant, c'est que nous faisons partie des rares acteurs capables d'avoir à la fois un regard depuis la capitale, c'est-à-dire depuis Paris, mais également depuis 5 entités régionales, des commandements subordonnés ou des hauts représentants de l'État français, qui ont énormément de délégations pour conduire des relations bilatérales ou multilatérales dans la région. Et ça nous permet de traiter aussi bien avec les grands acteurs qu'avec tous ces acteurs de taille intermédiaire ou de petite taille, comme les îles du Pacifique. Voilà, nous cherchons donc à consolider en permanence notre posture de puissance régionale. Et comment est-ce que nous faisons ça? Eh bien, il y a une stratégie française pour l'Indo-Pacifique qui a été publiée il y a 18 mois à peu près, dont vous avez certainement entendu parler. Et si je vais résumer, nous approchons la zone selon 2 volets sectoriels. Ces volets sectoriels sont d'une part les enjeux de défense et de sécurité et d'autre part la promotion des biens communs mondiaux, comme le climat, la biodiversité, la santé, etc. Et la deuxième approche, ce sont les piliers géographiques, avec le renforcement de nos partenariats avec les grands acteurs de la région, mais également une mobilisation renforcée auprès de toutes les organisations régionales. Et du coup, dans cette région Indo-Pacifique, ce groupe transatlantique que nous représentons va-t-il être une puissance médiatrice qui va soutenir et renforcer un ordre multipolaire, ou alors sommes-nous, nous 4, en compétition entre nous, au risque finalement de perdre la main là aussi? Ceci étant dit, en espérant ne pas avoir été trop long, je laisse la parole.
Merci, mes
camarades.
Merci. General Magawon.
Well, thank you very much. Of course, I'm a stand-in today. My vice chief was supposed to be here, but when I had the opportunity to come, I jumped at it because the UK is about to embark on its defence and security review, the first one we've had for 5 years, with a new government in place since December. And in order to deliver that security review, we need to have a conversation because that review's got to go right for the United Kingdom. It's got to go right for our colleagues to my left and right if we're going to serve them as part of the alliance. So I'm really keen to have that conversation. So my aim really over 10 minutes is trying to get that conversation going. I want to talk a little bit about the military relationship between the UK and Canada, naturally, the UK's position with regard to the future of NATO, and our ongoing and further developing posture in the Indo-Pacific region. But before I sort of touch on those 3 things, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this integrated review, talking about the sorts of debates that I think we're going to have over the next 3 or 4 months. We're heading for the so-called summer timeline. We're going to deliver the review. The Prime Minister's going to deliver the review in the summer, and it's going to be matched to the comprehensive spending review. So we're not going to make promises that we can't keep from a fiscal perspective. Now, why are we having this review, and why is it the most significant one for 5 years? And I think it's because of all the things we've talked about this morning. There's a recognition across the United Kingdom's defence and security architecture that the situation is rapidly changing, and we're familiar with why. The re-energisation of hostile state activity, so-called sub-threshold activity associated with it be interfering in elections, attempted assassinations on the streets of Salisbury, cyber attacks, manipulation of information, and simply the exploitation of a mass of intelligence and information that just wasn't there before in terms of its volume. And this changing context is forcing us to think again about our defence and security posture. And it's not just about defence, it's across the whole of government, and I'll come back to that in a second. There are a couple of things, though, that are not going to change through the review, and the first one is the government has declared that the defence budget, one of a number of budgets across the UK government, is ring-fenced, and 2% of our GDP at least will be spent on defence, and 0.5% above inflation will continue to be spent on defence year on year. And even though I'm going to say the word, Brexit has occurred, or is certainly occurring through this year, as we've said before, we're not leaving Europe, and we're not walking away from European security. And we look forward to a detailed and operationally focused conversation with our European partners about European security as we reset following the Brexit decision by the people of the United Kingdom. But there are a number of emerging themes that are coming out of the review already, even though it's only just been set and the Prime Minister announced its existence in December. The first, if I pick on maybe 4 or 5, the first one is this business of operate and fight, and that we fight above a certain level in a traditional way. And one could argue that we're not fighting above that level because we're successfully deterring that conventional fight. Yet we operate at the sub-threshold level. So that below conflict level, although there's a bit of a blurring between that line, is increasingly where we find ourselves on a day-to-day basis. And the conversation, certainly in the United Kingdom, is how much do we continue to invest in fight to ensure that we don't, but we're up for a fight if we need to, and we successfully deter, to keep our adversaries, particularly hostile state actors, below in the sub-threshold. And if we're going to invest more in sub-threshold, then how much and what? And how easy is it to jump between the two? And our view is it isn't easy. Certainly when I was growing up, we always said, well, if you train for the hardest thing, war fighting, you can kind of do everything else. I think history shows that that's not really true. And therefore, how much do we have 2 structures? Do we have a fight structure, a war fighting structure, and do we have an operate structure? And where's the investment? We're not sure about that. The other reason why that we're so focused on revamping this review is, as Dick mentioned, I'm the deputy commander of this new command, strategic command in the United Kingdom, and that's come about because of a number of things, but certainly because we're increasing our investment in space, and we're certainly increasing our investment in both offensive and defensive cyber. So we have 2 new domains, if you will, on top of the traditional 3. And underpinned is this business of exploiting information, not just in terms of influence, but exploiting battle space information in real time to enable the right decision to be made at the right time in the battle space. So this is changing the context of how we operate or how we fight. And this is invoking something that we're calling multi-domain integration. And what is multi-domain integration? It's to ensure that the various capabilities, say, for example, in the North Atlantic, a P-8 aircraft can talk to a Type 23, soon to be a Type 26 state-of-the-art ASW frigate that can be cued by an ISR satellite that can cue an Astute-class submarine, all within a single battle space at the right time with that feed of information and intelligence. Well, we're not sure that we've answered all those questions or whether we've got the actual tools and the space to be able to answer those questions. So that's kind of quite internal integration, but I haven't mentioned the sorts of problems we're going to have across government. So can we talk to our UK intelligence community partners in that space? Can we talk to our internal security office, our home office? Can we talk to our foreign office? So there's a broader integration across government to meet these broader threats. Can we talk to our allies sitting to the left and right of me across NATO or coalitions of the willing? So this layered, integrated approach is certainly what Strategic Command's about, and we don't have the confidence at the moment that we've identified the right questions to answer and invested accordingly in this increasingly rich battle space that we're finding now. A couple of other things that we are focusing on associated with what I've just said, and this is so-called, and I think it's come from a US colleague, although we're using it increasingly, is this so-called sunset, sunrise. That I'm pretty confident that I could quickly write a good list of sunrise capabilities to get after the sorts of things that's troubling us based on what I've just said. It's much harder to take an operational risk and say, do you know what? I think we're going to disinvest. We're going to sunset these capabilities because, yeah, we want them, but we think probably that we're prepared to take the risk because we're not going to use them as much as we think we're going to use these sunrise capabilities. That's a very difficult operational conversation. It's a very difficult political conversation. And this is where it turns to NATO, I think, because we talk about mobilize and modernize. Mobilize to fight tonight and modernize to fight tomorrow. And certainly at the moment, I mean, NATO's us. You know, NATO is its member states. And there's certainly a focus on mobilization. The NATO Readiness Initiative, so-called NRI, is very much focused on mobilizing to fight tonight, although clearly it's going to take 4 or 5 years to reach a future operating capability. But has the alliance got the appetite to modernize? Have we, as an alliance, got the appetite to sunset certain things and take some risk so we can go after this slightly richer problem that I've been talking about? A couple of other things before I move on to the regional aspects that I was going to mention. The first is people, and the sorts of people that we're going to want to employ in the future, I think are in some ways exactly the same as when I joined. We're still going to need to fight the close fight. People are still going to have to close with and kill the enemy because war and conflict is a human interaction, and that will never change, and we must never lose sight of that. But having said that, there's much more of a transactional relationship, I think, between our young today, certainly when I joined the British Marines. And so a transactional relationship is something that needs to be contracted in a way that is probably something that we're not geared up to in the UK in the way we need to. And also, against this operational context, the richness of talents, the technical richness of talents, is much broader than it was when I joined. We need offensive and defensive cyber warriors. We need people who can understand the complexity of bringing intelligence and information into a cloud architecture, ensuring the design of that architecture is right, with the right protocols and identity access management to exploit that data at the right time and the right place. To start to talk that language. You know, Luddites no more. You can't hide behind being a Luddite anymore because the people coming through aren't, and we've got to be credible as we go through. But either way, those are the people that we're going to need to appeal to, in addition to the more traditional skills in the future. And I'm not sure in the UK defence that we're absolutely geared to that yet. We recognise it, but not necessarily geared to it. And looking to tomorrow's programme, something we're absolutely seized with is greater agility within our acquisition processes. What does that mean? You just trip that out, and it's easy to say. Well, we talk about spiral development, that we should take risk. We should take risk on the requirement. Well, unless your requirement's absolutely sealed at 100%, then we're not interested. It's not, your business case is not going to go through. Well, we don't know. We don't know what technology is going to be available next year, next month. And so let's work on 30% and spirally develop from there. Let's take some financial risk. Let's take some commercial risk. And the industry partners in this room, please come with us on this. And it's a push and pull. You tell us what you think we need, and we impress upon you what we think we need and have that rich conversation. And we certainly in the UK, we don't feel that we need to be up and dressed anymore. We don't think we need to have everything absolutely signed and sealed and you can't come in. But we're prepared to open up a little earlier and take that risk because the situation is so much more fluid and we're just not fast enough as we have been in the past. So I said I was going to touch on a couple of regional aspects, and it would be odd if I didn't talk about the UK-Canada military relationship, which is clearly grounded on a very strong political cooperation. And this is personal for me. I've been to Ottawa many times. I have an intelligence background. I've served with Canadians in Afghanistan, and I have a number of very close Canadian military friends over the years. We work we work side by side in Eastern Europe in the so-called enhanced forward presence construct. In your case, in Latvia, in our case, Estonia. We work with each other through the Middle East, not least in Iraq, and also in the Mediterranean. And we also thank you, borrow half your real estate as well over in Suffield, or certainly the British Army does. I've been seconded to the British Army, and I know how useful that is to us. So we're extremely grateful for the support that Canada provides to the UK military, and I hope will continue to provide. I said I'd touch on NATO, and I think we're going to have a conversation about NATO, but the UK position, even going into the integrated review, is pretty clear. And that is that, you know, the cornerstone of our security, the cornerstone of UK security is NATO. And we will continue to invest politically, militarily, in that alliance as it adapts, as we adapt to this changing operational climate. And I think we put our money and our men and women where our mouth is. We are the largest defense spender in Europe, the second largest across the alliance. We contribute our own nuclear deterrent to the alliance. We contribute our cyber capabilities to the alliance. And our conventional forces as well. And like a lot of colleagues in the room, we're committed in Iraq, we're committed in Afghanistan, we're committed in the Black Sea, we're committed in the Mediterranean. So we will continue to do that. We are fronting up with a pretty relatively large for UK package to the US demand, quite rightly so, for an enhancement to our commitment through readiness, the NATO Readiness Initiative, through a range of operational capability packages. And we absolutely think we play our part in the very high readiness forces that we contribute to the alliance. So I don't think that is going to change as we go through our review. And then finally, on the Indo-Pacific region, and how we view that. And I think that is going to be a rich conversation through our review. But we're certainly committed, I think, along with certainly the other member states here in the room, to its security. We see a broad range of threats in the Indo-Pacific region, from ensuring freedom of navigation at sea through to climate change. And we feel that as a responsible member of the international community, the international security and defense community, that we need to step up and ensure those threats are met. We're an integral part of the FPDA, the Five Powers defense arrangement. We're increasing our regional structures across a number of countries in the Far East. And we have a foot on the ground in Brunei. We have a foot on the ground in Singapore, and clearly in the Middle East and in the Indian Ocean to launch into the Far East. We'll see how that plays as the review goes through, but I don't think we'll be rowing back from that. And we continue to provide an almost permanent presence, military presence, in that part of the world. I could rattle off the military, particularly maritime capabilities that we've had over the last 3 or 4 years, and we continue to have in that part of the world. And the culmination of that will be the deployment of our so-called CSG, or Carrier Strike Group 21. I've just been talking to Admiral Davidson about how we might be able to support him and other partners in the region when that Carrier Strike Group, based on our Queen Elizabeth carrier, deploys in the second half of 2021 to the region with our new Carrier Strike capability centered around the F-35. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General. Admiral Davidson?
Thank you. If you'll indulge me, I think I'll speak from the podium.
Please do.
I went to the Naval Academy after all, and if a professor told you at the hour immediately after lunch, it's not nap time in the room, and you fell asleep and were not standing, obviously, you would receive a chalk eraser fully laden with chalk in a uniform not unlike this one. So as opposed to receiving a round in that environment, I think we've all been forewarned. Good afternoon and aloha. No, come on. This is your chance to stay awake. Aloha, aloha. Very good. It's nice to see everyone. There was an important part of my bio that did not get mentioned. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm from America, and I came to gloat about my hockey team. Dick and I were speaking for just a few moments about how little time we have in all this rotation, moving about the theater, so to speak, to actually see things other than the engagements like you're seeing here today. It was nice to roll into the room last night, turn on Sportsnet, I think it's called. Is it Sportsnet, right? Mm-hmm. Every hockey game got a review last night. That is not something you see in Honolulu, trust me. I was actually very fortunate, though. I was in St. Louis just this past weekend. I got to see the Blues play the Stars and win 4-3 in a shootout, thanks to Ryan O'Reilly, Ontario boy. You know, could not be happier with my team at this point. I know the real season is starting here on the what, 7th, 8th of April? Something like that, I think. Anyway, it's a good feeling when your team is the defending Stanley Cup champions and currently in first place in the Western Division. What's that? Like the Raptors? Yeah, I'm sorry. Not my sport. I moved to St. Louis the year they were established. I was waiting 52 years for that. So anyway, all that said, one can never get too comfortable with the status quo, a lesson that is as true in hockey, so I will cease my gloating, as it is in the business of global security and national defense. And I appreciate the remarks of Henri and Rob. New geopolitical realities, expanding warfighting domains, emerging technical capabilities are indeed challenging the status quo worldwide. From October in 2013 to December 2014, I had the great privilege to be a commander of a NATO formation, and that was the Naval Striking and Support Forces in NATO. And during my experience there, I observed firsthand the resilient nature of NATO and the importance of its mission to safeguard the freedom and security of all its members by political and military means. That is something that has not changed, that I do believe is status quo. And what stood out to me then, and certainly rings true today, is that our values, the Western values that underpin our alliance, are the backbone of the rules-based international order and something that we can rely on. NATO is a values-based alliance committed to democracy, universal human rights, individual liberties, good governance, and the rule of law. NATO has been the foundation for stability around the globe now, given missions over the last 20 years, for some 70 years in total. But it is now operating under a new paradigm. China, Russia, continuing challenges with a violent extremist threat. Pandemics, as you're all reading about in the news over the last several weeks, are all challenges to the status quo in global security. In the interest of time, and to leave room for questions, I'm going to focus my remarks on China for a minute, but certainly would welcome comments and questions on the other threats I outlined, and there are still others. But in stark contrast to NATO's values-based alliance, the Communist Party of China promotes a drastically different value system, not just in the security realm, but also to governance, to trade, to human rights, to intellectual property protections. I could go on and on. I say it all the time. China represents the greatest long-term strategic threat to security in the 21st century, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but to the entire globe. The Communist Party of China is actively seeking to supplant the established rules-based international order in order to dictate new international norms and behaviors and new relationships, not only in the region, but across the globe. Indeed, this very public goal is to establish norms that are driven, guided, and enforced by the party in Beijing, one with Chinese characteristics, they frequently say. Beijing's approach is a pernicious one. The party uses coercion, influence operations, and economic, diplomatic, and even military threats to bully other states to accommodate the Communist Party of China's interests. And these actions often directly undermine the sovereignty of other nations, and they are threatening regional and global stability. The Communist Party of China is looking to change the world order to one where Chinese national power is more important than international law. Indeed, we, not just the United States, but all nations, we are in a strategic competition between a Beijing closed and authoritarian vision for the future, and in my words, the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific and what I hope you'll think is a free and open rules-based international order. That said, this competition does not mean conflict. We must be doing everything possible to deter a fight, and we must be prepared to fight and win should competition turns toward conflict. Looking toward the future, those committed to the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific must achieve an advantageous security environment by demonstrating the capability, the capacity, and the will to deny China's objectives and, if necessary, to impose cost on their military forces so that they cannot achieve their objectives via military means. And in order to accomplish these objectives going forward, there are 4 key focus areas that guide our strategic initiatives at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and serve as a roadmap, I believe, for like-minded nations when we're speaking about deterrence and the capabilities that we need. First, we have to increase our joint and combined force lethality. We continue to develop and field new technologies. Along with that must go new operational concepts and the capabilities necessary to deter and then prevail in armed conflict should deterrence fail. Our investments must harness the advanced capabilities provided by a network of leading-edge technologies, such as integrated air and missile defense, long-range precision fires, joint and coalition command and control networks, and resilient logistics and sustainment networks and suppliers. I agree with what was said earlier today. There will always be human character to war. That is not changing. But the arms are, and the methods of coercion are, being applied by humans in a way in which we have not seen in several decades. The capabilities I mentioned above are critical enablers to deter day to day, in crisis, and if deterrence fails, key to our ability to fight and win. Second, we must enhance our posture and design, how we operate and where we operate. We are developing a blueprint that enables capabilities in all domains and creates the virtue of mass without the vulnerabilities of concentration. This includes ensuring our Indo-Pacific posture provides a combat-credible deterrent that protects free and open trade routes through the air, sea, land, space, and cyberspace. This is the work of the international community, and the contribution of our allies in the region is part of this posture. In all, it's going to include establishing more advanced radar and missile defense capabilities, not only to protect the North American continent, but U.S. territories and outside the continental United States as well, from ICBM and hypersonic threats in the future. Improving our logistics and sustainment infrastructure and command and control in order to refuel, replenish, and refit our platforms throughout the region. And increasing forward-based rotational force deployments to improve our mobility and agility while demonstrating our commitment and resolve to our allies and adversaries alike. The third focus area is to advance our exercises, our experimentation, and our innovation, not only within the United States, but with our allies and partners. We are focused on improving our joint and combined force readiness and our capability as we look to the future. We must also modernize our exercise program to deliberately integrate experimentation and extensively exercise in a joint and combined command and control environment. We continue to increase the complexity and strengthen the multilateral integration of our exercises. Just a few examples. RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific exercise, due to be executed this summer, is the world's largest international maritime warfare exercise. Canada will perform its role as the Maritime Component Commander and as the Deputy Air Component Commander this year. The United States also conducts Keen Sword, a major bilateral, typically bilateral, anti-submarine warfare exercise with the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. We are encouraged by the Canadian Navy's participation in this critical exercise, which is one of the many examples of maritime nations seeking to counter Beijing's influence in the Indo-Pacific. Ultimately, these exercises provide us the ability to reveal the capabilities we want the region to see and conceal the things we don't want them to see as well. The final focus area is strengthening our allies and partners. We seek to increase our interoperability, our information sharing, and the access of our allies and partners across the globe to enhance our capabilities and improve our coordination for competition. Our allies and partners must seek opportunities to increase our combined operations, exercises, and training across the globe as well. This requires a focus on ensuring access to shared domains, especially as it relates to integrating space and cyber, as well as assuring access to the free and open airways and seas. Our militaries will only accomplish this if we regularly fly, sail, command and control, integrate, network, orbit, train, exercise, and if called upon, fight together across the globe. In my mind, the end state is an integrated coalition that can regularly demonstrate its operations in all domains, assuring international norms are protected and dissuading potential adversaries from military action. In closing, we, the United States, are committed to defending the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And we're committed to that alongside our allies and partners. Indeed, anyone is welcome to that vision. If the global community, through her economies, through the militaries, through our societies, bands together to maintain the rules-based international order, a free and open one, if you will, we will win this competition. I am optimistic about our future. I'm optimistic about the future of NATO and our alliance network, as well as the future of global security, because of our values. It is my conviction our values compete well. They compete extraordinarily well against China's pernicious approach, and frankly, the threats we face together and across all levers of power. I thank you for your time. Look forward to your questions. Thank you. No. Thanks.
Thank you, Admiral. General Rouleau.
Well, thank you, and I recognize that I'm the last one between a healthy Q&A session and the great talks that we've heard, so I'll move through this at some speed. I think it's testament, though, that Henri, Rob, and I met just individually this morning. We've never met before, so we had a chance to talk just about business generally, and of course I sat with the Admiral to talk about operations, but none of us coordinated anything we were going to say today. And the parallels, the convergence behind the ideas is surprisingly strong, and not surprisingly strong, I should say. And so I think that speaks to the shared values. Yes, we may emphasize certain things more here or there, but there's a lot of commonality. Bon matin tout le monde, Monsieur le Vice, Monsieur les anciens vices, Monsieur les généraux et les amiraux, Mesdames et Messieurs, ça me fait plaisir d'être ici. J'aimerais remercier Henri et votre gang pour nous permettre d'avoir un événement comme celui-ci où est-ce qu'on peut en discuter de notre profession des armes ensemble et puis honnêtement. Fait que je vous remercie beaucoup. The Global Transatlantic Cooperation from my perch as Commander of Canada's Joint Operations Command invokes thoughts of opportunities and risk, one of 29 member states in NATO, and then those who agitate against, as you've heard, what we stand for, values, rule-based order, etc. The backdrop to my comments is going to leverage what we do in a transatlantic sense. And here I won't discuss in any detail the issue of the security of the homeland. I think that's best left for Q&A if we want to go there. But I think General Coates in the panel this morning spoke to the fact that the defense of our homeland as Canadian Armed Forces personnel is critical in underpinning whatever value we can provide to NATO in times of conflict, and I don't think we should lose sight of that. I'll leverage a little bit what we do overseas. We are the framework nation for the battle group in Latvia, as you heard this morning. And we are accompanied by the Czechs, the Italians, the Poles, the Spanish, the Slovakians, and the Albanians. You know, when we started that mission, the Russian disinformation called it a Frankenstein battle group that would never be able to do anything. We haven't heard that from the Russians for a while, because I can tell you, while it hasn't been easy, there is real capability coming out of that battle group. It is ready to fight tonight. It will be a fight that has been worked over several rotations with 7 different nations, but it would be a very competent foe, I can assure you. We also do air policing in Romania. We have warships that operate under MARCOM's, NATO's leadership. And of course, we do multiple exercises and engagements. In essence, we take our readiness and turn it into deterrence. We take our forward presence and turn it into collective defense. So in that sense, I see NATO as having forward deployed forces. In our context, those that are quite far east. There are forces that are in depth, more in Western Europe, where we have operational support hubs, headquarters and such. And then we also view ourselves on the North American continent as being a strategic reserve of sort for NATO. If there is crisis on the European continent, there is a strategic reserve of combat power sitting in North America that belongs to NATO. And yes, it's challenging to get there, but it's here nonetheless. So there's a clear connection between my country, the Atlantic Ocean, and Europe. And it's expressed doctrinally, it's expressed organizationally, it's expressed functionally, and in many ways. But to me, and in discussions I've had with the CDS, it connects JFC Norfolk with the strategic lines of communication that is the Atlantic Ocean, with deployments that we have in places like the Ukraine or Latvia. It's a system of systems, if you will, in a military continuum. Again, we could expand on that in Q&A. I'll talk quickly about what we've learned in the recent past. I'll talk about geography, and then I'll just give a couple takeaways. So the first piece, about what we've learned. And really, I'd start by saying what we've relearned from when I joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 1984. And while I didn't know it at the time, generals and admirals really fought the Cold War through force posture. We'll put a wing in Baden, a fighter wing in Baden. We'll put a mechanized brigade group in Lahr. And we're really relearning now a lot of the international and theater level movement implications of moving forces around the world, including if the lines of communication are contested. And I think NATO's exercise Trident Juncture went some distance to sort of illuminating for us the many things that we might have forgotten in the last 20 years when we've been fighting a sub-rosa counter-VEO type fight for the most part. We're relearning operational sustainment, the art of operational sustainment, including tracking that back to the supply chain and depot materiel handling. And as the officer in my military who's responsible for the depots, and it's a shared responsibility when you start looking at the supply chain, it's a very complicated space, and there's shared equities. And to be able to see your supply chain, know where your materiel is at, and be able to move it at the right place in the right time is something that we need to work on. We're relearning how to employ fighting forces at scale. And in that sense, when I go talk to young troops, I say, hey, look, we've been talking about the golden hour for the last 15 years, our contract to you. You get hurt, 60 minutes, we'll have you do a roll 3. We now need to give way to talking about mass casualties in CBRN environments and less about the golden hour, because the character of warfare is changing. The work we're doing is very much aligned with how our UK 3-star described it, this operating below the threshold kind of continuous, and I call that the balance of probabilities space, where 95% of the calls for service may occur, while also needing to be credible in a state-on-state context. We're also relearning about our ammunition stocks, about our loadouts, as the Admiral for Indo-PACOM just mentioned, and how we exercise replenishment. And for the first time last year in a long time, we actually exercised replenishing our warships in a simulated environment. This gives me renewed respect for those who planned and led at this level in the Cold War. Not to be confused with me. I was a foo in West Germany, lost more often than not, and too junior to understand the complexity of what was happening. If you'll allow me an analogy before I turn to the new things that we're internalizing, I would just say that, my first free fall instructor when I learned how to parachute that way was illiterate. He was a phenomenal soldier, but he couldn't read and he couldn't write. Legitimately, couldn't read, couldn't write, but he was a wonderful soldier. We don't have that anymore. Every one of our troopers is a knowledge worker. Right down to infantry battalions, I would argue that they're all knowledge workers. And so I think we look at literacy in terms of organizational literacy, being able to unlearn, relearn, and execute. And the question is, are we organizationally literate enough in this fast-moving world? So the new things that we've learned is that, as General Coates mentioned, Canada is no longer protected by geography, as we once were. And so whether it's kinetically, informationally, societally, with the dependencies that we have on space-based technologies to go to the ATM and take out money, Canada is no longer the safe haven that we once thought it was. Our deployed forces are in constant competition. Almost regardless of the mission that I have the privilege of commanding with my element, every one of those missions and the people who lead them are in constant competition every day, sometimes against states themselves and sometimes against proto-state actors. And I would tell you that some of these sub-state actors have state-like capabilities, armed UAVs, multiple launch rocket system, tubed artillery, good intelligence networks. I mean, these are sub-state actors with these kind of state-like military capabilities. And so as we operate, we are being hailed. We are being intercepted by fighter aircraft flying surveillance missions. We are subjected to indirect and direct fire, subjected to false information, electronic warfare, and cyber effects. And what this does is it ups the ante for the tactical level commanders that we deploy forward. It also compresses the operational level of war. What is happening at the tactical level, wherever, is of much more immediate concern to the strategic level, and it's squeezing the operational level of warfare, if you will. We're also learning that we need to pay careful attention, very careful attention, to policies, permissions, authorities, all the way through to orders, to ensure that we're giving room to maneuver to our deployed commanders. There's no environment out there that is static. And so we will get a mandate for a mission, and part of our job is to make sure that we're trying to create enough maneuver space so that a deployed commander can adapt to the environment that is inevitably going to change, so that he or she can deliver the kind of outcomes we expect in an environment that's never static. And if the framework is too brittle, you're ineffective after a couple weeks. We need to find the right balance between policy objectives and authorities and fielding supple enough forces to contest well, or in the worst case, to combat well. We're learning about new capabilities and structures that we need to continue to invest in. We argue that the information theater is the central theater of conflict moving forward. How well positioned are we in the information space? Cyber, space, counter-UAS. We can no longer enjoy the air supremacy that we grew up fighting with in Afghanistan. We also need to digitize the enterprise. And we need to do that in a way that can leverage the immense power of data. And we need to do that for two reasons. Number one, to stay connected with the dominant coalition partners who lead coalitions. If we can't talk to our American brothers and sisters, we can't operate within the coalition. At the advent of quantum-enabled cryptology and things like that, we have to make very specific investments to continue to be able to talk in a fifth generation or in an advanced context. But we also need these digitized enterprise capabilities to prevail militarily, increasingly moving forward. Lastly, I'd say we need to, I think, what we've learned is we need to internally have a common understanding and a shared agreement on lexicon, on what it is we're talking about in some of these new areas that we're operating in. What is the difference between partner force operations, capacity building, security sector reform? And we use some of these terms interchangeably, but they're not. They all mean subtly different things. And so we have to agree as conflict evolves what it is we're actually talking about. I'd like to turn in the second part here to geography real quick. And I would say that geography absolutely matters, and at the same time it is utterly meaningless. In that sense, I would say the Transatlantic link is not just about resources moving east as it was in 39 to 45. The Transatlantic link, for me, represents lifeblood for CAF in many ways. It is where many of our friends, allies, and interests lie to the east, not exclusively. They also lie to the west, obviously, but in this sense, we're talking east. And it's where our strategic lines of communication largely push towards. But it presents a dilemma, because if Europe is threatened, it's almost sure to be the case that North America will be threatened at some level. And so with the reality that we have a finite military, what are the choices we're going to make in that hour of need? What can we afford to push over to the continent? What do we have to keep here to safeguard the homeland? So the tri-command part of my command, Cjoc and Northcom with NORAD, we contemplate this continental defense piece. But I would say geography absolutely doesn't matter a lick in terms of cyber information warfare, space-based capabilities. These know no Westphalian borders. And so our goal moving forward in the CAF is to flesh out these emergent domains, as again you heard Rob mention. We have to flesh out these emergent domains. It used to be that they were an adjunct to the main event, and we would argue in many cases now they are the main event, supported by the more traditional domains. When I go to talk to our battle group in Latvia, I tell them, you are not doing land operations here. You are doing information operations in the land domain. Understand why you are here. You're here to send a message to would-be adversaries. We're engaged. And so I think that these emerging capabilities must be fleshed out. Everything for us moving forward seems to relate to the pan-domain environment. We can ascribe slightly different monikers to it, but fundamentally what we're talking about is we've moved beyond the air, maritime, and land domains, the domains of cyber, space, information. We are being contested, and we are contesting in all of these domains. And it's happening simultaneously and concurrently. This is the crux of the challenge with pan-domain warfare. And so these emergent domains call for a fresh approach to policy development. And I think Bill C-59 recently in Canada is an excellent example of how the government approached that from a cyber perspective. But then it has to follow. Strategies, orders, plans, all have to ensure the nesting of these non-traditional capabilities into what we do. A few closing thoughts, if I may. As I mentioned, if we hope to be successful, we have to internalize what the pan-domain environment means to us. Number two, integration is vital. The convergence of things confronting us out there calls for precision here in terms of how we deliver effects and how we do so at speed. It also brings forward the notion of persistence. There has to be some depth to our capabilities, some depth to us as a military, because we're going to be, I would argue, relatively persistently engaged, at least moving forward in the mid-run. Mission command and pushing power to the edge is essential to good tactical outcomes. As General Mattis said in his recent book, the trinity of warfare, chance, uncertainty, and friction, it is sure to hit at precisely the moment when that new one-star calls home and says, what should I do over here in the Middle East? He or she probably won't be able to get the direction they're looking for from me, so we have to empower people to be comfortable making decisions within a defined set of parameters. This leads to, therefore, enhanced professional military education. And I would argue we need less linear operational planning procedure type people, and we need much freer creative thinking, design thinking type staffs and leaders. And a great example is, I'm just looking out in the audience, and there's a young professional there, Jessica, who just stood up our joint targeting capability. It's a voyage of discovery, right? I basically wrote a one-pager and said, here's broadly what we're looking for, and they got after it. Alignment and convergence are key. The adjacencies in the big fight are crucial. There's nothing I can do as Commander Cjoc that doesn't invoke Commander Mil Perscom or a service commander, and so as commanders, we need to pay attention to the adjacencies. Growth is better and better, not bigger and bigger. We need to rethink what we see as growth. The Latvian brigade, of which we're a part of with our battle group, dug into the side of a barn in the ground, a couple radios and a couple people. That is not how we traditionally, I think, look at brigade command and control, but I think we need to learn different lessons. Second last is blended solutions. Man and machine, digital and analog, a tight obturation or a loose obturation organization, one that can be very tightly coupled or very loosely decoupled depending on the context. The issue is, I think the blend is what's going to get us success in the future, not a magic box of technology or one specific weapon. And the last thing I would say is resilience. I think at the individual level or as a collective, we need to think about and work on our resilience, because I believe that we're in for a period of increased activity, and we're going to have to manage the storm.
Thank you, General. Phil mentioned in an introduction that my last job was as the PM's National Security Advisor, so I'm going to try and do what NSAs do for their principal, which is to question and to probe and to prod a little bit some of the assumptions that our panel brought forward. So my first one is this. It is at least arguable that NATO is stretched to deliver on its North Atlantic mission. Russia is resurgent. There are all sorts of difficulty in that area. And a great many good things have been done from a military and security perspective over the course of the last little while. So my question is, if this is the case, if NATO is at least to some degree stretched, is it reasonable to give NATO an unlimited geographic area of interest and to have the North Atlantic Council and the Military Committee worry as much about what's going on in Vietnam as they worry about what's going on in Latvia or Estonia? Now, I appreciate this question can be answered from the perspective of a foreign minister, but I'm asking you gentlemen from the perspective of senior military personnel. Is stretching NATO's geographic area of interest potentially going to significantly affect its capacity to deliver in its core area? Whether it does or does not, do we have a choice? I'd welcome any comments you might have.
Yeah, I'll have a very short answer on that, which is it could be a huge mistake to stretch NATO AOR and to have so wide an AOR for NATO. And this is the reason why I'm very happy. I'm glad that Joint Command Norfolk, I would say, is back on the picture, because then we are back to the basics, which are the transatlantic link and how to make sure that we support each other in case something happens. And I think that's a very good move, and this is maybe the most important move of the past 2 years. Everything else should be within an ad hoc coalition environment and shouldn't be NATO.
Thank you. Rob?
I absolutely agree with Henri. I think we need to match the resources, the capabilities and the readiness of the alliance to our operational and therefore, well, political and therefore our operational appetite. And that analysis needs to be done, and us as senior military officers need to provide that military advice through our defence, through our CHODs, through the military committee and up to the NAC. So there's no doubt that we have a professional responsibility to match that. Having said that, and I would say this being a British officer, I think from our perspective, because of Iraq and because of Afghanistan, we've allowed our capability to secure the North Atlantic to atrophy. And the threat in the North Atlantic from Russian submarines is real and is something that we must prosecute through enhancing our investment in that area, enhancing our collaboration across the alliance. So whatever we do as an alliance globally, security of the North Atlantic from a Russian threat would be, if not at the top, very close to it.
Admiral, I was implicitly talking about support to your area, to your bailiwick. How do you react?
Yeah, just for a moment to build on what Rob had to say and something that Mike said. The geography is providing advantages, but it's also an incredibly shrinking space. If we're to talk about global threats to our security, and I think NATO as a political apparatus and as a military apparatus, has been the foundation of security against a global threat in the past, certainly transformed over the last 20 years, but also addressing a global threat. I think NATO has important contributions to make there. I can tell you, setting aside the specifics of, Vietnam, if we're addressing the threat that's manifest in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to China and the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, the importance of the international seas and airways, I can tell you that allies and partners coming together in the South China Sea, for example, either to operate independently in that open seaway or to exercise with others, has been hugely impactful on the assurances that ASEAN nations, those nations on the rim of the South China Sea, needed to be able to stand up to the coercion that's going on behind the scenes in the diplomatic and economic sense. Certainly the capability has to match the ambition. This is, I think, a comment that was made a little bit earlier today, but we can't ignore the global threat that is manifest. One only need to look at how the coronavirus has proliferated to understand that there's heavy Chinese influence in Europe as well, and here in the North American continent too. And we need to be thinking about that as how that influence is moving across the globe and what we need to be ready to respond to.
Thank you. Mike?
With all that's been said, I would just add, every kind of military, the application of military power, every decision we make has a cost and a trade-off. And part of our job, I think, is to be honest with those risks and opportunities. You can use a maritime ISR aircraft for general or cued surveillance over land. It's not well adapted for it, but you can use it. But then there's an opportunity cost, as the Admiral says, in the ASW game. And then it takes time to rebuild that expertise. That doesn't happen in a week. And so just being clear-minded about where the risks and opportunities are and making sure that we're passing that up, I think, is part of the way I see my job.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit, if we could, about the T word, the threat word. I think it's one of those things that we talk about generically. There's the threat that we have to deal with from China or from Russia or from somewhere else. And I understand that from the military perspective, it must be extraordinarily frustrating explaining to the rest of us, what is worrying you about the threat. But I wonder, from my perspective at least, you have old-fashioned kinetic threats. You have what I call kinetic threats at a distance. You have cyber threats, and you have the hybrid threats that we talked about this afternoon. As you're thinking about the kind of cooperation that this panel is meant to address, either within the area of NATO or more broadly, as you've all argued we should deal with in one shape, fashion, or the other, are all of these kinds of threats, and probably others that I don't know about, the kinds of things that transatlantic cooperation should deal with? Should they be exclusively military? Are there other organizations within your countries that should deal with these kinds of issues? And when you advise your political masters, what prominence do you give to the more modern threats, as a couple of you have mentioned? I think it's generally accepted that you can't have an army without some people who are prepared to carry a rifle and do something with it. But the other kinds of threats have shifted a great deal. Could you talk generally a little bit about the kind of threats that you worry about, and that eventually all governments are going to have to address probably more fully than they have currently? Amira?
If I may shoot first.
Not at me, please, but yes.
It's okay, it's fine. In fact, I would say the biggest threat is the loss of credibility of the Western world, and especially of NATO alliance. The reason I say that is, thinking of that, then, you have to be able to address both conventional threats, and that's the credibility of NATO or Western forces in the EFP, in the Baltic states, but it's also the resilience, both of the alliance as such and of the every single nations. It's are we able to deploy? Are we able to talk to each other? And therefore, if we have that in mind, is how to make sure that we never lose credibility. Then one is able to invest whatever it requires, whatever it takes, to make sure that we address that. So I prefer to see it like we cannot afford to lose credibility wherever.
Gentlemen, any of you?
I would maybe offer, I worry about the cost, the aggregate cost of the threats we face that are relatively minor, but in the disinformation space. multiple disinformation claims, in this case made by the Russians against some of the missions that are Russian-facing. There's an aggregate cost to those claims, maybe even with our own publics. And so the need to sort of set the record straight or to counter the information space is something that I worry about, because at the end of the day, there's got to be stuff in the good side of the ledger for the inevitable bad news that's going to happen with a military deployment to balance it off in the eyes of our public. Attribution's a problem. I think if we can't attribute or characterize who the threat is coming from, it's impossible to respond. I don't think any government would just respond without attribution. And then the convergence of the national defense and national security spaces. So to your question, is it better to have more? I mean, the CSIS and the CSIS, and I think there's so much power in dealing with some of these modern threats, like the kinds we face in the Middle East, by having community partners around you.
One of the things I hope everybody take away from this conversation is the power of alliances and partnerships and what it does in the face of threats. I'm sitting up here with 4 nations that have all contributed to the UN sanctions enforcement efforts against North Korea over the last couple of years to truly make a difference when it comes to ship-to-ship transfers and the security equation in Northeast Asia. That's only possible really with, as I said before, a common value basis, but also a common understanding of the threats and our ability to explain it to each other and see what that value is. The power of that enforcement effort, however, is not resonant in the militaries alone. It requires treasury action, it requires diplomatic action to actually see through it all the way to the end. So it's really all the elements of national power, and as I said, nations' power that's going to be required in order to compete in this global environment.
Thank you. Rob?
I mean, I just to add on some of the things that have been said, I think the first point from a British perspective is that we've got to make the case, as we go through our review, we've got to make the case that there is a threat. And that is not always easy to make. I think we just had an election campaign, and the talk of a threat, the talk of defense and security of the country was not on the ballot sheet. So, but the Prime Minister's given us this opportunity now through the review to make the case. So that's the first thing, is that we've got to demonstrate that there is a threat. And I think one of the reasons why there's been a problem is that we have fought wars recently of discretion, you could argue, and some of those wars are not yet complete. And they've been going on for some decades in a number of cases. So making the cases against that backdrop is not easy. Making the case that we need to be able to fight if required, I think Admiral mentioned it in his note, is right, and we absolutely as military professionals need to make that case. But against everything I've just said, it's even harder that we need to be able to make the case for the ability to warfight. But to answer your question directly, Dick, in terms of what worries people today, certainly in the UK, it's the influence of information in the media. It's assassinations on the streets of the UK. It is erosion or nefarious erosion of UK critical national infrastructure. It is the incursion through cyber attack of some of our ways of life. These are the things that are dominating the broader defense and security conversation in the UK, of which defense is just a part. And ensuring that we understand how we bring all the levers of power together against the threats that people do realize, the ones I've just mentioned, is all part of the answer.
Thank you. So I think I'll turn to some of the questions that modern technology has just provided me with. And I suspect this question comes initially from a Canadian. And the question is, should NATO have a posture in the Arctic? And from a Canadian perspective, let me just add a little bit of context. Traditionally, governments, plural in Canada, have been of the view that the Arctic should not be militarized. The global high range objective was to demilitarize the Arctic, or keep it as demilitarized as you can, much like the Antarctic. I think with the changing situation in Russia this gives rise to a whole raft of questions. So the question is, to some or all of you, what should NATO do in the Arctic? And I, of course, note Canada is not the only country that has an Arctic. I mean, there is the United States, and there are significant Arctics in Europe as well. So what's NATO's role in the Arctic? Admiral, you want to start again?
I'm not sure I have the answer. At least I can give you my position on that. I don't see a role for NATO as such in the Arctic, and I don't think it's expected from the nations involved in the Arctic, whether it's Canada, Denmark, Norway. What they are expecting from us as NATO members is to support them politically every time it's needed. Mm-hmm. So what I still believe is we need to have a discussion on Arctic in NATO. I mean, it's a forum where we need to have this discussion. We need to be fully aware of the concern of Canada, Denmark, Norway. We have to be ready to politically support them, but I do not see a role for NATO.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen?
I think I kind of changed my view, like 7 million square kilometers, right, of our north in the Arctic, and I think we have about 300 government paychecks that are paid out every month in the Arctic. And you think about the paucity of people compared to Russia, who has significant population in its Arctic compared to us. So my view has kind of shifted over time. Today, right now, exercise Nunalivut is happening. I don't know, my staff would know, but I think there's 5 or 6 NATO partners who are with us observing up north. And, I bet you our forefathers didn't think that they'd have to transit through, into the Arctic space to resupply Archangel to help keep the Russians able to fight. But they did. And if you think of 20, 30 years from now, where we might be combating or competing, and, maybe the quickest way to get there, I see more upside than downside and I know NATO's interested. I was going to meet DSAC here in a couple of weeks. I don't know if COVID-19 is going to let me keep doing that, but we were going to talk about that. So I see upside for it, frankly.
Good.
I agree with Mike. NATO's had a role in the Arctic for 70 years and has been operating up there persistently in the land, sea, and air domain ever since, and is an important part of, I think, our collective security.
Good.
Yeah, I think we're in the same position. Possibly, probably. Is there hostile state activity in the areas of responsibility of NATO member states who've got areas of responsibility in the Arctic? Yeah, particularly in the sub-threshold environment. So we're going to have to respond to that.
Thank you. So the next question from the audience is, it's a rather specific one, and I'm going to add to it to try and make it a little bit more general. But the specific question is, how should NATO respond to Turkish request for military support in Syria? And I guess the broader question I would invite comment on is, what have we in the West done wrong with Turkey? Over the course of the last little while, we've not done particularly well in keeping Turkey in the fold. And I realize this has a whole variety of dimensions, but from your military perspectives, if you're not willing to make believe you're foreign ministers today, what have we done wrong? Or more to the point, what could we do to bring Turkey a little bit more back into the NATO fold? Remembering that the first question, though, is how does NATO respond to Turkish request in respect of Syria? Nobody wants to be a foreign minister,
Look,
I see.
I'd like to get paid next month, so I'll defer. But I will say this though. When in a previous job with forces and the job that General Daw does today, commanding Kansofcom, there was Turkish forces deployed very proximate to Kansof forces up in northern Iraq, and it wasn't a bad thing. The collaboration was there. The tactical level coordination was happening. So, from my perch, your question is above my pay grade, but I think there's lots to build on at the tactical level.
If we...
Please, Admiral.
Okay, in fact, if we really want to play foreign ministers, I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is, how does it happen that the only permanent member of the UN Security Council who is at the negotiation table is Russia? So how does it happen that UK, France, US are not in a position to have all the parties around the table now. So, yeah, we got lost somewhere. I have to agree, but I think that's the key point in the current situation, and that should worry us for the near future.
Thank you. Anyone else? Or
I'm going to take advantage of my geography.
Okay, let me ask you another question. Over the course of the last few years, NATO membership has been increased quite considerably over what it was initially. Did this dilute the alliance? What to do with a member who stops conforming with the values of NATO? And I think it's fair to say there are a couple who fall in that category. And indeed uses its seat at the Council to block advancing goals and objectives. And I appreciate this question can be answered at a variety of levels. But has NATO enlargement reached the point where it's actually impeding the capacity of the alliance to fulfill its fundamental mission, either politically or from a military perspective? I remember being told when I was still working that during the last large enlargement, one of the biggest problems was a number of new NATO allies all had Russian equipment, and nobody could quite figure out what to do with them in a very short term. I'd like to think that's been resolved or partially resolved, but what do we do about NATO enlargement, and should we think about admitting Georgia and Ukraine next year?
I can still shoot first. I don't think the issue is really the values of NATO. The reason is we tend to forget then when, for example, Portugal or Greece joined NATO, they were not really, I would say, maybe I dare to say they were not maybe democratic countries at the time. So we don't have to be afraid of that. The real question is, and I'm back to my 3 conditions for cohesion of the alliance, and the 2 that are at stake are institutions. So enlargement means usually weaker institutions. So that's where we have to make an effort and maybe anticipate much more on the major changes. The second one is norms, meaning interoperability, that kind of thing. Yes, I agree. There is a weakness when a new nation joins, but after a while it's okay. I would say we have to be very careful with the gap between security provider and security consumers in NATO. That's where we may have, both at the political and at the taxpayer level, a problem.
I think as military officers, we've got to accept that NATO is a political alliance. We want it to be a military alliance, but it's a political alliance, and that's many of the reasons why it's been getting larger. But I think as military professionals, then we have to ensure that alliance adheres to its military standards. And Henri's been talking about them. That's why I think something like the NATO Readiness Initiative is important. That's why I think some of the very high readiness capabilities are important, that we need to adhere to those because that's what's operationally vital. Having said all of that, not everybody within the alliance needs to do everything militarily. And there may be certain bidding member states that might bring something to the alliance from an operational perspective, from an intelligence perspective, that we, us member states here, can't provide. And so we should take a broad view in terms of what member states and bidding member states could bring.
Good.
I agree with what Rob had to say here. NATO has the capability and capacity to match the ambition it agrees to pursue. And I think the NATO Readiness Initiative, the resources pledged over the last few years and going into accounts now, the 4 for 30, these are all indications of what it can step up to do, absolutely. I had the privilege of commanding a NATO formation in my past, and it was not an all-member headquarters and forces. In fact, it had less than half of the membership actually involved in it. This speaks exactly to what Rob is talking about here. Not all members need to bring everything to the game. But it is, I think, most important to remember that it's a political alliance. And the value system that underpins it, defending liberty, is a basis in which there is much to build on there, and we can't forget that.
Our battle group's a microcosm of your question. 7 countries, T-72s driven by the Poles, Kalashnikovs fired by most of the countries. I mean, it's different. It's difficult for deployed commanders to bring this all together. It's very difficult on the sustainment side of the house, where I think NATO is going to have to really work on the sustainment and the back end of the business. I mean, fundamentally, I think that's an area of some risk exposure that should be looked at. And as well, our country's ability to tap into that sustainment apparatus, because it could be perceived as a sole source. Even if you're going to the NATO logistics agency, you see where we have to rationalize our domestic policies with emerging NATO capabilities. But look, the power of having 7 capitals represented militarily in Latvia, I think outweighs whatever problems you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. The next question brings forward a topic that I'm very keen on, which is Huawei and what it's doing to NATO and to the world in general. The question is, what effect would the expulsion of the UK from Five Eyes because of the Huawei deal have on the alliance, and how can it be mitigated? I would note that while I was NSA and the Deputy of Defense, I was regularly lectured by the Admiral's colleagues in Paris and by people in the Chancellery in Berlin about the exclusivity of the Five Eyes and how it was not particularly helpful. But that was not the question. The question was, if the United States gets very determined to deal with the Huawei question from their perspective, what impact will it have on the Five Eyes? Or more generally, what impact will it have on NATO and interoperability and the sort of collaboration that you've all talked about as being a sine qua non of an effective alliance?
Look, I think, the discussion about Huawei is a technological and innovative discussion, and how that technology and innovation merges with the state. The control of the infrastructure, the delivery mechanism, and then the receiving mechanisms, Huawei's participation in all 3 of those industries, and they are essentially 3 elements, of an industry, depending on how you think about it, and its relationship to the state isn't just a military concern about information sharing. It's a sovereignty concern for the nations that would be giving up not just their classified intelligence, but their economic information, their information, their personal information, medical information. It goes on and on. And we've seen, I think, as we've described, whether it's election interference or cyber attacks, cyber extractions, we've seen the kind of danger that such a threat presents. And I think we ought to be thinking about that way. It's interesting the way telecommunications has moved, if you think about it almost philosophically, right? At the beginning, it was about reliability and verbal communication. Now it's about data. And what we're moving to is, well, gee, look what might be possible with all this data. And we've moved from a paradigm of reliability alone, meaning, the persistent access to it all, to a discussion about trust and whether that information is actually trustworthy. It's one to have it trustworthy in the information environment. It's quite another when that trust is going to mean whether 2 vehicles across the planet might strike each other or not. We've really, the integrity of all this has got to be addressed, and I think that's fundamentally what the threat of Huawei and the Communist Party of China link is to everyone else's sovereignty and security.
And there is a tension, Dick, between governance, like good governance and strong oversight and the ability to assure ourselves of security, and then what the warfighter needs, which is speed and precision. I just had a conversation recently with the Assistant Deputy Minister of Information, and I was expressing to him my my philosophical desire that we not constrain ourselves to thinking that our data had to be stored on-prem, you know, in our own servers. How, while I'm not a technological person, you know, we should be open to the secure cloud. We should be open to not having to own it all, because the perishability of information in today's day and age is much quicker as well. So maybe something that was 10 years ago more secret for a longer period of time today might only be valuable for 24 hours. And so we have to balance these things off, and it's creating a paradox where the military person in some cases might be more of a risk taker than the professional IMIT person, and we need to reconcile those perspectives.
So this is a political issue, it's a commercial issue, it's an issue associated with intelligence, Dick, as you've said, but ultimately it's a technical issue. And therefore, I have gone out of my way to read in as much technical detail as I can, of which nearly all of it is available at open source. The UK Government Communications Headquarters has released a lot of information at open source to support the decision that the UK government made a month or two ago. Now, I think there is no doubt that the UK's position is that it doesn't want to be reliant on a hostile vendor, and Huawei is a declared hostile vendor, and we want to invoke greater competition into the telecommunications space, and we are looking to do that over a period of months and years. However, the situation at the moment is that we are reliant on Huawei for 4G, and we will be reliant on Huawei for 35% of edge capability for 5G. That has nothing to do with the networks associated with the passage of classified information across the Five Eyes networks. They have nothing to do with each other, and I'm sure there are plenty of people in the room who are more expert than me, but by reading through this, in my view, it's pretty convincing. But we are concerned such that the UK has set up a Huawei analysis center, and we judge, might be slightly arrogant, that we know more about Huawei's incursions into our networks than any other country or member state of the alliance. To the point where we explained the situation to our US colleagues, and we asked for alternative options to wean ourselves off Huawei as we move to 5G, and we presented the solution to our US colleagues, and they were unable to come up with an alternative. So that's currently where we are.
Thank you. So I've been instructed by Yuri to say that for the next 10 minutes or so, if anybody would like to go to the microphones, we'll also take questions from the floor. But in the meantime, I have another one. Can Europeans truly continue to afford both NATO and the European Union's common security and defense policy organizations? Will the EU eventually have its own integrated military forces, security and defense organizations? What will this do to NATO? So, Admiral, you can answer for yourself or for Monsieur Le Drian, but...
or for President Macron. Happy to do so. Okay.
Please.
I think things are crystal clear, meaning that no one wants to duplicate what exists in NATO. We cannot afford that, and not only for the forces, but also for the headquarters. I mean, we lack human resources to man NATO headquarters today. So can we afford, let's say, any EU HQ or standing HQ? I would say it's now a nonsense, while maybe, let's say, 5-10 years ago, some people were still dreaming of something totally different. I think that as they go by, we find the right balance between what NATO, EU, and ad hoc coalition can provide to let's say, international security.
Anyone else?
Well, I might be unique in this room in that I've commanded an EU operation. Would you believe that? So I commanded Operation Atalanta, which is the counter-piracy operation off the coast of Somalia in the Gulf of Aden and the Somali Basin, with very close support clearly from our French colleagues, particularly the Spanish and the Italians, and also the Chinese, by the way, because, as Henri alluding to, that the EU was unable to provide the number of escorts that I needed to ensure that, that piracy was kept at bay in the Somali Basin and the Gulf of Aden. And the Chinese were very happy to oblige and provide me with a couple of extra frigates on a Tuesday afternoon. And I think that plays to the point that we should absolutely focus on the critical allied security architecture that is NATO. And clearly, we're now out of the EU party anyway, so that's clearly where our focus will be, NATO.
Thank you. Sir?
My name is Chuck Davies. I'm a research fellow at the CDA Institute and a retired military officer. To try and pull together a thread from this panel and the ones this morning, I pose a question: is it time that nations, our nations, the Western nations, either within a NATO context or in some other forum, began to build the kind of national doctrine, national capacity to apply whole of government or to apply all national instruments to problem solution on these global events? The way NATO has built up over years a common doctrine and a common way of doing business. So if I reasonably clear there.
If I could begin, you know, I think the capacities are there. As I examine the Indo-Pacific and some of the resources I'm requesting across the government, we're having a conversation with our Five Eyes partners, plus France and Japan, that is completely transparent. So just the White House led what we called the like-minded conference in Sydney just 2 weeks ago, where folks from foreign ministries, developmental agencies came together from the Five Eyes, Japan, France, to have a discussion about what the developmental needs were across the Pacific Island chain. Having that now built, I think, into a persistent rhythm, maybe something even formalized, a formalized process, I think would be incredibly important. But it just speaks to one example of the kind of things that are necessary, but also starting to get traction already in the whole of nations approach.
And I think the issue is not necessarily more of stuff, it's alignment. Like if we can better align and reduce the gaps and seams between us, we get more bang for our buck. And I think we don't spend enough time focusing on that alignment. It's tough. And sometimes it brings us into tension when the boundaries of one to another are right there. But I think that's what the environment demands more and more of, not organizations that are, you know, blissfully doing their own thing, disconnected.
I agree completely, and I think I mentioned that because of the disparate nature of, the diverse nature, I should say, of the threat, the military arm will only necessarily be part of the solution, or in certain cases, not the solution, part of the solution at all. I think, though, as we within the UK try to develop what we call a sort of fusion doctrine, bringing the various government departments together even before we go out the door with an alliance context, we should be, and Mike just said it, it's hard. And I think it's hard because, well, I'll speak for myself, we kind of want to take over. And we say we don't want to be in charge, but we kind of give a body language thing that we do want to be in charge. And that frightens people across other government departments. And it's this cultural difficulty that we need to keep working on, so people have trust in that we're not trying to take over. It's just the way we are.
I just clarify that I come to it as the veteran of trying to remove institutional boundaries in terms of the operation of a provincial reconstruction team in Kandahar. And the problems were here in Ottawa, they were not in Kandahar.
I think one of the important things also to remember is during the post-Cold War period, we've had a paradigm in which there was not really an outside threat to the values basis. That pushed security into the uniform, when in fact, as we look about the global threats and how they're manifesting today, security is really a whole of government responsibility. Whether we're talking about cyber norms, election security, the security of our local water, sewage, electricity, power companies, the security of our currencies and how they move across electronic systems. This is a much bigger security approach is required than just worried about the uniformed end of things.
So I think perhaps this will be the last question as we're moving towards the end of the panel. I think it's generally recognized that no one country, even the United States, can deal with all of these threats by itself. So the alliance is very, very important. So the question is, how do we modernize the alliance? Do we need to start thinking about niche activities for some of the smaller countries, as opposed to some countries, all countries trying to be all things to all people? Do we need, for example, more special forces capabilities? Should some countries focus on cyber or whatever, as opposed to trying to do a little bit of everything? So I would invite you to answer this question to the extent you'd like. Then I will each give you an opportunity for 2-3 minutes to wrap up as you see appropriate. So if you were the king of the castle, if I can put it that way, what would you do to modernize, to make more effective the alliance that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half? And does it involve, or should it involve, some greater measure of specialization by at least some of the medium and smaller countries?
Maybe I'll start. I don't think I've started, so I'll have a go. So this debate is very much alive in my country, and we talk about breadth or depth. Mm-hmm. And every and I think even the United States, every defense budget is going to be clearly scrutinized, and rightly so. And against the breadth of the threats that are out there, can the member states, maybe, and Admiral Davidson will speak for himself, but maybe the US aside, can it afford to cover the totality of them? And we need to work that through, because the alliance needs to be dependent on other member states to ensure they can front up. So we're going to have that debate. And I think the business of sub-threshold provides an opportunity to have potentially niche capabilities for member states. If you're above the threshold and you're war fighting, it's kind of the same type of capability. But if you're into influence operations, if you're into offensive cyber capability, if you're into an enhanced special operations capability, working with like-minded member states, I think there is an opportunity to develop some niche and depth capabilities at the expense of breadth.
I think a commitment to the whole as kind of the entering argument is important, but for a lot of reasons, each nation that comes to the alliance, whether they've been a technological innovator in certain technologies, an innovator in certain technologies, or have a tradition of strength in some other aspect of the portfolio, ought to be at liberty to bring that niche capability to the organization. I think it's important.
So I agree with that. I think
and part of it is dependent on geography, right? So we have some NATO nations on the Arctic, some nations, in Southern Europe. Over here, I'm sorry.
No, so that's what I've got written here. 3 oceans, search and rescue. Like, we've all got our different context. And, to get to the party where the rest of our partners are, it's 5,000 miles of sailing or flying. So the portfolio that we need necessarily will look different than maybe what Poland needs. And so I'm a fan of the organic development of the capability. I think the space to look at developing is in the cognitive. We focus on the hardware, but I think there's a lot of room as an alliance to develop cognitively in terms of the future.
On the military side first, I think that we now have in NATO a very mature capacity planning process, and I'm pretty sure it is able to address most of our concerns. Still, on the military side, I think that what we need is more agility in the C2 structure. Currently, we have larger and larger HU, while we have less and less forces to command. I'm not sure the taxpayer will like that a lot in the near future, so we have to be very careful with that. On the political side, I'm pretty sure that we need more or better political ownership of the alliance. To summarize, 2014 and Ukraine cannot happen again. Okay.
Thank you. So going in the reverse order than that from which we started, can I invite you to make a closing statement or so? Mike, starting with you.
Very briefly, I would say, part of my job, I think, is to make sure that I'm keeping the chief aware of what the zeitgeist is at the operational level. We're lucky to be a member of Five Eyes. We're lucky to be a member of Nato. Can you imagine how much we'd have to spend to have the kind of access and visibility and awareness that Five Eyes gives us if there was no Five Eyes? We're probably spending, 5 cents on the dollar because we're a member of that community, and that's special. And so part of my job is to make sure I'm keeping the chief aware of kind of where we stand in that trust relationships. I mean, these are the things that matter to me these days.
Thank you. Admiral?
I think we need to always recall across this alliance structure what brought us together, and that was the defense of our liberty. It's so easy to highlight the things on the margins, which we have mechanisms to mitigate, whether it's caveats in NATO operations or larger political caveats. It's the things that brought us together. And liberty is worth defending and is newly challenged in this new era, and we need to be committed to defending that liberty.
Thank you. Rob?
I would say that we need to have the agility to face the changing character of conflict, and if that changing character is about constant competition or whatever it is, but that we mustn't forget that the nature of conflict has never changed and never will. We need to be ready to for that potential shock. So we don't lose sight of why we're here. It's basically a human interaction. As Professor, and as we go about that, Professor Michael Howard, who has been an eminent military historian in the UK for many years, you can't predict the future, but the key is that we're not too far wrong, and that's our challenge.
Last word, Amiral?
J'ai le droit de terminer en français?
Oui.
Ouais, cool. En fait, quoi que certains puissent penser, la France et son président en particulier tiennent énormément à l'OTAN. On le redit tous les jours. En revanche, ce que l'on exprime le plus fortement possible, c'est que nous avons peur de perdre ou de gâcher ce bel outil. C'est quelque chose que collectivement, nous n'avons pas le droit de faire. Et c'est pour ça que j'évoquais tout à l'heure ce risque et que nous avons tous connu quand on a commandé des unités. Au moment où nous sommes dans notre zone de confort, les choses deviennent dangereuses. Voilà vraiment ce qui doit guider notre action et ce qui doit nous guider, nous, militaires, mais également au niveau politique, à en permanence questionner l'alliance, enfin, la cible est-elle la bonne? Sommes-nous vigilants? Faut-il se remettre en cause, etc. Encore une fois, ce n'est pas pour le plaisir de changer, ce n'est pas pour le plaisir de casser. Au contraire, c'est pour protéger un outil qui finalement est encore très jeune. Voilà.
I think we've had an excellent panel discussion. Please join me in thanking them for their contribution. Merci beaucoup, j'apprécie beaucoup que ça ait commencé. Merci beaucoup.
C'est bien amusé.
All right, we're going to head off to a 15-minute break. Keep in mind that what happens after this break is the speech by the CDS. That means a lot of people in uniform here, if you're not on time, I'm taking notes and I'm reporting back to your boss.